The Shadow Beneath the Floorboards. Chapter 1. The Old House on Willow Street. The house on Willow Street had always been a source of fascination for the townsfolk. It was an ancient, crumbling structure, its paint peeling, its windows dark and lifeless. The garden was overgrown, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air around the house was always colder, the wind carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. No one had lived in the house for decades. It had been abandoned after the previous owners had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The townsfolk whispered of curses, of dark forces that lurked within the walls, waiting to claim the next victim. But to Emma, the house was a dream come true. She had always been drawn to old, forgotten places, and the house on Willow Street was the perfect project. She bought it for a song, determined to restore it to its former glory. There was something about the house that called to her, a strange, magnetic pull she couldn't explain. Chapter 2. The Move. The move was uneventful, save for the strange looks she received from the townsfolk. They watched her with a mixture of pity and fear, their eyes filled with a silent warning. But Emma ignored them, too excited to start her new life in the old house. The interior was just as she had imagined, dusty, musty, and filled with the remnants of the past. The furniture was old and covered in sheets, the walls lined with faded wallpaper. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but Emma didn't mind. She saw potential in every corner, a blank canvas waiting to be transformed. She spent the first day cleaning, sweeping away the dust and cobwebs, uncovering the beauty beneath the grime. But as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, she began to feel a sense of unease. The house was too quiet, the silence oppressive, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Objects seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking, and fleeting shadows danced at the edge of her vision. Chapter 3. The Whispering Walls. That night, Emma was awakened by the sound of whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there, coming from the walls. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she could hear the faint sound of scratching, as if something was trying to get in. She got out of bed and followed the sound, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The whispers led her to the living room, where she found a loose floorboard. She knelt down and pried it up, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. The air that wafted up from the hole was cold and damp, carrying with it the smell of earth and decay. Emma shone her flashlight into the hole, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness. She could see nothing, but she could feel something presence, cold and malevolent, waiting in the shadows. She felt an overwhelming urge to keep looking, as if the darkness was staring back at her. Chapter 4. The Discovery. The next morning, Emma returned to the hole, determined to uncover its secrets. She gathered her tools and began to pry up the surrounding floorboards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the floor. Inside the compartment, she found a collection of old yellowed papers, diaries, letters, and photographs. They belonged to the previous owners of the house, a family who had lived there over a century ago. As she read through the papers, she began to piece together their story. The family had been plagued by strange occurrences, whispers in the walls, shadows that moved on their own, and a feeling of being watched. They had tried to leave, but something had prevented them, a force that seemed to bind them to the house. The final entry in the diary was written in a shaky hand, the ink smudged with tears. It spoke of a shadow that lived beneath the floorboards, a creature that fed on fear and despair. The writer had begged for help, but no one had come. The words seemed to echo in Emma's mind long after she closed the diary. Chapter 5. The Shadow. That night, Emma was awakened by the sound of scratching. It was louder now, more frantic, and she could feel the floorboards vibrating beneath her feet. She got out of bed and went to the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The floorboards were moving, shifting as if something was trying to push its way through. Emma watched in horror as a dark, shapeless form began to emerge from the hole. It was a shadow, but unlike any shadow she had ever seen. It was alive, its form shifting and twisting, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The shadow moved towards her, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. Emma tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her body frozen in fear. The shadow reached out to her, its cold, formless hands wrapping around her throat. Her vision blurred as darkness crept into the edges of her mind. A deep, suffocating void. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The whispers faded away, and the house was silent once more. But Emma was not the same. She felt different, though, as if a part of her had been taken. Chapter 6. The Ritual. Emma knew that she had to do something. The shadow was growing stronger, its presence more oppressive, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before it claimed her completely. She sought out the help of a local historian, an old man named Mr. Thompson, who had studied the history of the house. He told her of a ritual that had been performed by the original builders of the house, a ritual designed to keep the shadow at bay. The ritual, he warned, was dangerous and had been forgotten by most for good reason. The ritual required her to gather certain herbs and objects and to perform a series of incantations. It was dangerous, and there was no guarantee that it would work, but Emma knew that she had no other choice. As she prepared, she began to notice subtle changes in herself, moments of lost time, strange thoughts that didn't feel like her own. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. That night, Emma performed the ritual. She stood in the center of the living room, the objects arranged around her in a circle, and began to chant the words of the incantation. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the house. The shadow emerged from the hole, its form shifting and twisting, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. Emma continued to chant, her voice growing stronger, more confident. The shadow began to fade, its form dissolving into the air, its whispers growing fainter. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the shadow was gone. But the silence that followed was not comforting. It was oppressive, thick, with something unseen. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Emma sealed the hole beneath the floorboards, determined to never let the shadow return. The house was quiet once more, the whispers gone, the air warm and inviting. But as she walked through the house, she noticed something strange. The shadows seemed darker, more pronounced, and she could feel a presence, cold and malevolent, watching her from the corners of her vision. She knew that the shadow was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return, and perhaps it had never truly left, just found a new place to hide. Chapter 9. The Legacy. Emma never spoke of what happened in the house on Willow Street. She finished the renovations and sold the house, determined to leave the past behind. But the shadow followed her. She could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, lurking in the corners of her mind. She knew that it was only a matter of time before it returned. And when it did, she would be ready. Or at least, she hoped she would be. Epilogue. The house on Willow Street still stands, its windows dark and lifeless, its garden overgrown. The townsfolk avoid it, speaking of it in hushed tones and fearful glances. But sometimes, on a cold, dark night, if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers. The whispers of the shadow beneath the floorboards, calling out to you, begging you to come back. But beware, for once you enter, you may never leave. The end.